Imagine for a moment that you could count every human being alive today. 8 billion people. 8 billion stories, dreams, and futures. Now imagine going back in time, back before cities, before agriculture, before writing. Back 70,000 years to a moment when you could count every human being on Earth in a single afternoon. The number would shock you. Perhaps 10,000 people. Maybe fewer. Some scientists believe it dropped to as low as 2,000 individuals. 2,000 humans. That's fewer people than live in a small town today. Fewer than attend many high schools. In that moment, our entire species balanced on a knife edge between survival and extinction. You've probably never thought about this. Why would you? The world feels full of people, bustling and crowded. But hidden in your DNA is the evidence of this ancient crisis. Written in your genes is the story of the generation that almost went extinct. The generation that somehow, against impossible odds, survived. This is their story. This is your story. Because every person alive today descends from those few thousand survivors. We are all children of the bottleneck, all inheritors of their struggle and their triumph. If you drift off during this journey through deep time, that's exactly what this is for. Whether you stay awake for every detail or let the story carry you into sleep, you'll travel back to the edge of human extinction and discover how we survived. Let the rhythm of this narrative guide you. Let the past wash over you like a gentle tide. We begin our journey in Africa, 75,000 years ago, when the sky itself was about to change. Picture the African landscape as it existed 75,000 years ago. The sun rises over the savanna, painting the grasses gold and amber. The air is warm, dry, carrying the scent of acacia trees and distant rain. This is the world of your ancestors, though you would barely recognize them as such. They wake with the dawn, these early humans. Not so different from you, really. They feel hunger, love, fear. They dream, though we'll never know what filled their sleeping minds. They laugh, create, and mourn their dead. But their world operates by rhythms you've mostly forgotten. The small band emerges from their shelter as morning light grows stronger. Perhaps 30 individuals in this group, moving through the landscape with practiced efficiency. They know this territory intimately. Every water source, every fruiting tree, every place where animals gather. This knowledge keeps them alive. The children stay close to the adults, watching, learning. A young girl observes her mother selecting stones, looking for the right type of rock. Not just any stone will do. The rock must be fine-grained, must break in predictable ways. Her mother finds one, sits cross-legged in the shade, and begins to work. The sound of stones striking stone rings across the morning. Flakes of rock fall away, each strike deliberate, purposeful. This is technology, human innovation at work. The hand axe that emerges after minutes of careful work will butcher meat, dig for roots, cut branches. It represents thousands of generations of accumulated knowledge. Nearby, two men discuss something in their complex language. We don't know the words they spoke, the grammar they used. But we know they possessed language. We know they could communicate abstract ideas, plan for the future, share stories about the past. Their brains were as large as yours, their capacity for thought equally sophisticated. What they didn't know was that their world was about to end. To the north and west, beyond the horizon, beyond even the furthest territories their people had ever explored, something was building. Deep beneath the surface of the earth, in a place that would one day be called Indonesia, magma was rising. Pressure was accumulating. The planet was preparing to convulse in ways that would darken the sky across the entire world. But on this morning, none of that was apparent. The band of humans moved through their day according to ancient patterns. The women gathered roots and berries, their knowledge of plants encyclopedic. They could identify hundreds of species, knew which were nutritious, which were poisonous, which could heal illness or ease pain. The men tracked a small group of antelope, reading the landscape like you might read a book. A bent blade of grass told them which direction the animals had moved. The age of droppings told them how long ago. The depth of hoofprints revealed the animal's size and condition. This wasn't primitive guesswork. This was sophisticated deduction based on detailed observation. By midday, the heat grows intense. The band rests in the shade of a rock outcropping. They share food, groom each other, tend to children. An old woman, her hair graying, her face lined with years of sun and wind, tells a story. The younger ones listen, rapt. Maybe she speaks of ancestors, of the formation of the world, of why the stars move across the sky. These stories bind the group together, create shared identity, transmit crucial knowledge across generations. You carry fragments of their culture still. Not in any conscious memory, but in deeper ways. In your tendency to gather around fires. In the way stories move you. In your fundamental need for community and belonging. These things were forged in groups like this one, refined over hundreds of thousands of years. As afternoon arrives, a successful hunt brings celebration. The hunters return with an antelope, and the work of butchering begins. Every part of the animal will be used. Meat for eating, bones for tools, sinew for binding things together, hide for carrying water or making simple clothing. Nothing is wasted. The calories from this kill will sustain the band for days. Evening brings cooler temperatures and different activities. Someone tends a fire, keeping it alive, feeding it carefully. Fire is precious. Starting a fire from scratch requires skill, effort, and the right materials. It's easier to maintain a fire than to create one anew. So fires are guarded, transported, kept burning across weeks or months. Around the fire, as darkness settles over the savanna, the band gathers. This is when the deepest sharing happens. Stories are told in greater depth. Relationships are strengthened. Plans are made for tomorrow's activities. The fire creates a circle of warmth and light against the vast darkness of the African night. Above them, stars wheel across the sky in patterns their ancestors had observed for millennia. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of light. They recognize constellations, use them for navigation, weave them into their mythology. The cosmos feels close in a way that urban light pollution has stolen from most modern humans. This was life before the catastrophe. Not simple, not primitive, but different. A human existence shaped by different pressures, different knowledge, different relationship with the natural world. They faced constant challenges. Disease, predators, injuries, drought, conflicts with other groups. Life expectancy was short by modern standards. Many children didn't survive to adulthood. But those who did were strong, adaptable, incredibly knowledgeable about their environment. And there were more of them than we once believed. Recent evidence suggests that Africa might have supported tens of thousands of humans 75,000 years ago. Different groups, different cultures, spread across the varied landscapes of the continent. In the forests of Central Africa, along the coasts, in the grasslands, humans had adapted to diverse environments. They didn't know about each other, these scattered populations. A band in what is now South Africa had no knowledge of groups in Ethiopia. They were separated by vast distances, by mountains and deserts and rivers. Each group believed themselves to be the people, perhaps the only people. But they were all about to be tested in ways they couldn't imagine. Nature was preparing a catastrophe so immense that it would reshape the human story. It would reduce all of these scattered populations to a handful of survivors. It would create a genetic bottleneck so severe that humans would become one of the least genetically diverse large mammals on Earth. The evening fire burns low. The band settles into sleep, unaware that in the north, across an ocean they've never seen, the Earth is about to explode. The Earth has always been restless. Continents drift. Mountains rise and erode. Ice ages come and go. Life adapts or perishes. This is the nature of the planet, this constant change, this endless transformation. 75,000 years ago, the world was already in the grip of an ice age. Not the deepest freeze, but cold enough that massive ice sheets covered northern lands. So much water was locked up in ice that sea levels were lower than today. Coastlines looked different. Land bridges existed between places now separated by water. For humans in Africa, the ice age meant variation in rainfall. Periods of drought alternated with wetter times. The Sahara Desert expanded and contracted. Sometimes it was green, supporting diverse life. Other times it became an impassable barrier. These cycles shaped human evolution, pushed our ancestors to adapt, to innovate, to survive changing conditions. But the Ice Age was a slow process, unfolding over thousands of years. Humans could adapt to gradual climate change. They could migrate, develop new strategies, wait for conditions to improve. What was coming, though, was not gradual. What was coming would happen in a span of time shorter than a human lifetime. Let's journey north and west, across the African continent, across the Middle East, across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. We arrive at a place that will one day be called Sumatra, an island in the Indonesian archipelago. But 75,000 years ago, with lower sea levels, this region looked different. More land connected the islands. Here, in the northern part of Sumatra, there existed a massive volcanic complex. The Toba caldera, though it wouldn't be called that for many thousands of years. This was no ordinary volcano. It was a supervolcano, one of the largest on Earth. Its magma chamber stretched deep into the crust, a reservoir of molten rock under immense pressure. Supervolcanoes don't erupt often. Thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years might pass between eruptions. But when they do erupt, they reshape the world. The last major eruption of Toba had occurred hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Now, the chamber was full again. Pressure was building. The crust above was weakening. There would have been warning signs. Earthquakes shaking the region with increasing frequency. Hot springs growing hotter. The ground itself slowly rising as magma pushed upward. If humans lived in the area, and they might have, they would have noticed these changes. But they would have had no context for understanding what was coming. No cultural memory of supervolcanic eruption existed. Nothing in human experience prepared them for what was about to happen. Then, on a day that seemed like any other, the Earth exploded. The eruption of Toba 74,000 years ago was one of the largest volcanic events in the past 2 million years. The energy released was equivalent to millions of nuclear bombs detonating simultaneously. The sound would have been heard thousands of miles away, a roar that defied comprehension. A column of ash and gas blasted into the stratosphere, rising higher than 30 kilometers. For context, commercial airplanes today fly at about 10 kilometers. This eruption column reached 3 times higher, punching into the upper atmosphere. At the top, it spread out, forming a vast umbrella of volcanic material. Then the ash began to fall. In the immediate vicinity of the volcano, the devastation was total. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and rock moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, swept across the landscape. Nothing survived. The flows buried everything under meters of material that would eventually cool and harden into volcanic rock. But the real global impact came from the ash. 4 days, perhaps weeks, volcanic material rained down across South and Southeast Asia. In some places, the ash accumulated meters deep. Imagine standing in a snowstorm, except instead of snow, it's fine, abrasive volcanic particles. They fill the air, making breathing difficult. They bury plants, killing them. They contaminate water sources. Archaeological evidence shows this ash spread across an area of perhaps 30 million square kilometers. That's roughly the size of Africa. Everything within this zone was buried, poisoned, transformed. Any humans or animals living there faced catastrophic conditions. But here's what made Toba truly world-changing. The ash that reached the stratosphere didn't fall back down quickly. It stayed suspended, circling the Earth, blocking sunlight. The planet began to cool. Scientists call this a volcanic winter. The principle is simple but devastating. Sunlight is blocked by volcanic particles in the upper atmosphere. Less sunlight reaches the surface. Temperatures drop. Plants, which depend on sunlight for photosynthesis, struggle to grow. The effects cascade through entire ecosystems. How cold did it get? This remains a subject of scientific debate. Some climate models suggest global temperatures dropped by several degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but consider that the difference between the current climate and the last ice age is only about 5 degrees. Even a drop of 2 or 3 degrees can trigger massive ecological changes. The cooling may have lasted for years. Some evidence suggests a decade or more of significantly reduced temperatures and sunlight. Other evidence points to shorter but more severe cooling. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, and conditions varied by region. For the humans in Africa, thousands of kilometers from the eruption, the first sign might have been the ash. Even at such distance, some volcanic particles would have reached them, carried by high-altitude winds. The sky might have taken on a strange color, sunsets becoming unusually vivid. Then the temperature began to drop. Imagine being one of those humans, trying to understand what was happening. You've experienced dry seasons and wet seasons. You know that sometimes the rains fail and food becomes scarce. But this is different. This is a chill in the air that doesn't go away. This is plants growing more slowly, animals becoming scarcer. This is a world that seems to be dying for reasons you cannot comprehend. The impact on Africa's ecosystems would have been severe. Tropical forests, which depend on warmth and consistent rainfall, would have suffered. Grasslands would have contracted. Water sources might have become unreliable as rainfall patterns shifted. The animals that humans hunted would have declined in number, struggling to find enough food for themselves. For human populations, this created a crisis. Remember, they lived on the edge of subsistence already. They depended on detailed knowledge of their environment to find food, water, shelter. When that environment changed dramatically, their knowledge became less useful. The fruiting patterns of plants shifted. Animal migration routes changed. Water sources dried up or became unreliable. Different human populations faced different challenges. Those living in areas already marginal, already difficult, had less room for adaptation. Groups that were small or isolated were particularly vulnerable. If a drought killed off game animals in their territory, they might not be able to migrate to better areas because other groups already occupied those territories. This is when the human population began to crash. Not immediately, not all at once, but over years and decades. Groups failed to find enough food. Malnutrition made people vulnerable to disease. Women's fertility declined under the stress. Infant mortality increased. The delicate balance that had sustained small populations across Africa began to tip toward extinction. We don't know exactly how many humans existed before Toba. We don't know exactly how many survived the volcanic winter and the difficult years that followed. But genetic evidence suggests the population declined drastically. Some estimates put the global human population at 10,000 or fewer individuals. Other estimates go as low as 1 or 2,000. To put that in perspective, many animal species today are considered critically endangered with populations larger than that. Mountain gorillas number around 1,000 and are the focus of intensive conservation efforts. In the aftermath of Toba, humans existed in numbers that would qualify as endangered by modern standards. But somewhere, somehow, humans held on. In some refuge, some place where conditions remained just barely survivable, a population endured. They didn't thrive. They didn't expand. They simply refused to go extinct. Finding that refuge, understanding how they survived, requires us to follow the evidence written in their genes and in the earth itself. Let's return to that moment of eruption and understand it more deeply. The Toba event represents one of the most significant natural disasters in human history, and yet it happened so long ago that we can only reconstruct it through careful scientific detective work. The volcano itself sits in northern Sumatra, now visible as an enormous lake, Lake Toba. The lake is 100 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. This isn't a crater formed by the mountain blowing its top. This is a caldera, formed when the magma chamber beneath the volcano emptied so completely that the ground above it collapsed inward. Imagine the entire landscape sinking, dropping hundreds of meters as the support beneath it vanished. The collapse itself would have created additional earthquakes, additional chaos. Over thousands of years, water filled this depression, creating the lake we see today. But the size of that lake tells us something crucial about the eruption. It tells us how much material was ejected. Geologists estimate that the Toba eruption expelled around 2,800 cubic kilometers of material. To give that number meaning, consider that when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, burying Pompeii, It ejected about 4 cubic kilometers of material. Toba was 700 times larger. When Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, it was considered a major eruption affecting global climate for several years. It ejected about 10 cubic kilometers of material. Toba was 280 times larger than that. This is why scientists classify Toba as a supervolcanic eruption. On the Volcanic Explosivity Index, which ranges from 0 to 8, Toba ranks as an 8. This is the maximum rating, reserved for the most colossal eruptions. To put it simply, nothing in recorded human history compares to Toba. The ash from this eruption spread across an enormous area. Layers of Toba ash have been found in India, Bangladesh, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea. This ash forms a distinct layer in sediment, a marker that geologists can identify and date. It's like a time stamp in the Earth's history, a line that divides before and after. In Malaysia, ash deposits from Toba are 9 meters thick in some places. 9 meters? Imagine ash piling up 3 stories high, burying entire forests, filling valleys. The landscape was transformed completely, buried under volcanic material that would take thousands of years to weather into soil. The eruption happened in stages, as massive eruptions typically do. First, perhaps, smaller explosions as the system breached. Then the main event, the catastrophic emptying of the magma chamber. This phase might have lasted days, with continuous ejection of material into the atmosphere. The roar would have been constant, punctuated by larger explosions as different parts of the system failed. Pyroclastic flows would have pulsed outward in waves. These are the most deadly aspect of large volcanic eruptions. They're not lava, which moves relatively slowly. They're avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments that can move at several hundred kilometers per hour. The temperature inside a pyroclastic flow can exceed 400 degrees Celsius. Nothing survives direct contact with a pyroclastic flow. Not plants, not animals, not humans. The heat alone is fatal, but the flows also bury everything under meters of deposits. Around Toba, these flows probably extended for 100 kilometers or more, racing across the landscape, sweeping into valleys, climbing over ridges. For any humans living in Indonesia or nearby regions of Southeast Asia, survival would have been impossible. This was an extinction event for local populations. The archaeological record from this region shows a gap, a period where human presence disappears. Whether those populations went extinct entirely or whether small groups managed to flee ahead of the disaster, we don't know. But the immediate devastation, terrible as it was, represented only the beginning of Toba's impact. The volcanic material that reached the stratosphere began its slow journey around the planet. Carried by high-altitude winds, the ash spread in a veil across the sky. This is what made Toba globally significant. The eruption didn't just destroy the local area. It affected the climate of the entire planet. Volcanic ash in the stratosphere reflects sunlight back into space. It acts like a sunshade, reducing the amount of solar energy that reaches Earth's surface. The result is cooling. The magnitude of cooling depends on how much material reaches the stratosphere and how long it stays there. For Toba, with its massive ejection of material, the cooling was significant. Ice core samples from Greenland show evidence of cooling around this time. Climate models suggest global temperatures might have dropped by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for several years, with regional variations even more extreme. In the tropics, where our African ancestors lived, the cooling might have been less severe than at higher latitudes. But even a modest temperature drop can have cascading effects on ecosystems. Combined with reduced sunlight affecting plant growth, the impact on food chains was severe. There's another effect to consider as well. The sulfur dioxide released by the eruption combined with water vapor in the stratosphere to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These tiny droplets increased the reflectivity of the atmosphere even more than the ash alone. They also affected precipitation patterns, potentially creating droughts in some regions and unusual weather in others. The Earth's climate system is complex, interconnected. When you perturb it significantly, the effects ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Ocean currents might shift. Monsoon patterns might change. The delicate balance that ecosystems depend on gets disrupted. 4 years after the eruption, possibly a decade or more, the planet struggled to return to normal. Gradually, the ash and aerosols fell out of the stratosphere. Gradually, temperatures began to recover. But for many species, including humans, those years of disruption were catastrophic. Here's what makes the Toba event particularly interesting from a scientific perspective. It provides a natural experiment. We can look at genetic diversity in various species and ask whether there's evidence of population crashes around 74,000 years ago. We can examine climate records and ecosystem changes. We can try to correlate these different lines of evidence to understand what really happened. The picture that emerges is complex. Yes, there was definitely a major eruption. Yes, it definitely affected global climate. But how severe was the impact on human populations? This is where the debate continues among scientists. Some researchers argue that Toba created a bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in human population that brought us to the edge of extinction. The genetic evidence, they say, supports this. Human genetic diversity is remarkably low compared to other large mammals, and much of the genetic evidence points to a population crash around this time. Other researchers are more cautious. They point out that genetic evidence can be interpreted in different ways. They note that archaeological evidence doesn't show a clear gap in human presence everywhere. They suggest that while Toba certainly had effects, maybe it wasn't quite as catastrophic as the most dramatic scenarios suggest. What seems clear is that something significant happened to the human population around 70 to 75,000 years ago. Whether Toba was the primary cause, one factor among several, or perhaps less important than other climate changes happening during this period, the evidence points to a population crash. And if the population did crash to just a few thousand individuals, the question becomes crucial. Where did they survive? What refuge sustained the last of humanity through the darkest time? Picture the world in the years following the Toba eruption. The sun rises each day, but its light is dimmer, filtered through a veil of volcanic haze. The sky has an odd quality, colors muted, shadows less sharp than before. The air feels different, cooler, with a fine dust that sometimes drifts down from the upper atmosphere. For the humans living through this, there is no framework for understanding what has happened. They don't know about volcanoes in distant lands. They don't understand atmospheric science or climate change. What they know is that their world has changed, and they must adapt or die. The first year after the eruption would have been the worst. The volcanic winter would have been at its peak, temperatures at their lowest, sunlight at its dimmest. Plants that depend on full sunlight for photosynthesis would have struggled. Growth rates would have slowed. Some species might have failed to produce seeds or fruit at all. Think about what this means for an ecosystem. Plants form the base of the food web. When they suffer, everything else suffers too. Herbivores find less to eat. They become malnourished, their populations decline. Predators, including humans, find fewer animals to hunt. The effects cascade upward through the food chain. In Africa, different regions would have experienced different impacts. The tropical rainforests, which depend on consistent warmth and moisture, would have been particularly vulnerable. The cooling temperatures and altered rainfall patterns would have stressed these forests. Some areas might have contracted, opening up to grassland or becoming more seasonal. The savannas, the grasslands that covered much of East Africa, would have changed as well. The species composition would have shifted. Some grasses thrive in cooler conditions, others need warmth. The animals that depended on particular plant species would have had to adapt, migrate, or decline. For the small bands of humans scattered across Africa, these changes created immediate challenges. Imagine being part of a group that has lived in one territory for generations. You know every water source, every good hunting ground, every plant that's edible. Your survival depends on this knowledge. Now that knowledge becomes less reliable. The fruiting tree that always produced in a certain season fails to fruit. The stream that always had water runs dry. The animals you usually hunt have moved elsewhere, following the shifting vegetation. You're forced to make decisions without good information. Do you stay in your traditional territory and try to make do with less? Do you migrate to new areas, risking conflict with other groups who already claim those territories? Do you split up, with different family groups trying different strategies? There are no good options. Every choice carries risk. And for many groups, the choices they made weren't enough. They couldn't adapt quickly enough. The margin for error was too small. Population declined. Groups merged or disappeared. The youngest and oldest would have been most vulnerable. Infants and young children need consistent nutrition to develop properly. Malnutrition in early childhood has cascading effects on health, on cognitive development, on eventual fertility. Old people, already fragile, would have struggled to survive on reduced food. But it wasn't just lack of food that killed. The stress of changed conditions would have increased conflict between groups. When resources are plentiful, human groups can avoid each other, maintain peaceful coexistence. When resources are scarce, competition intensifies. Territories become worth fighting over. What might have been resolved peacefully in good times becomes violent in bad times. Disease would have taken its toll as well. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. People become more susceptible to infections, less able to fight off illnesses that they might have recovered from in better times. If you've ever experienced a period of intense stress, you know how your body becomes more vulnerable to getting sick. Multiply that effect across entire populations struggling to survive. As years passed, the immediate volcanic winter would have gradually eased. The ash and aerosols in the stratosphere slowly fell out. Sunlight strengthened. Temperatures began to recover. But the damage was done. The human population had crashed. Vast areas that once supported humans were now empty. Genetic evidence suggests that during this period, human diversity plummeted. We can see this by comparing human DNA to that of other great apes. Chimpanzees, despite having a much smaller total population than humans today, have much more genetic diversity. Two chimpanzees from different populations are more genetically different from each other than any two humans from anywhere on Earth. This tells us something profound. It tells us that at some point in the relatively recent past, the human population went through a severe bottleneck. Most of the genetic diversity that existed before was lost. Only the genes of a small surviving population made it through to the present. The bottleneck shows up in multiple ways in our genetics. It shows up in our mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mothers to children. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA suggests that all modern humans share a common female ancestor who lived roughly 70 to 80,000 years ago. This doesn't mean she was the only woman alive, but rather that she's the only one whose mitochondrial lineage survived to the present. Similarly, analysis of Y chromosome DNA, which passes from fathers to sons, points to a relatively recent common male ancestor. Again, not the only man alive, but the only one whose Y chromosome lineage persists in modern populations. These genetic signatures tell us that sometime around 70 to 75,000 years ago, the human population was very small and very constrained. The diversity that we see in modern human populations all descends from that small surviving group. But where was this group? If the population crashed to just a few thousand individuals, they must have been concentrated somewhere. Some refuge must have sustained them through the darkest years. The answer appears to lie in Africa, but not just anywhere in Africa. The evidence points to specific regions, specific ecological refuges where conditions remained survivable even as much of the continent became harsher, more difficult. Some scientists point to the coast of southern Africa, particularly the area around the southern cape of what is now South Africa. This region has unique characteristics. It sits where two oceans meet, the Atlantic and the Indian. It has diverse ecosystems in close proximity, from coastal zones to mountains to inland areas. It has year-round water sources and diverse food resources. Archaeological evidence from caves in this region shows continuous human occupation through the period of the Toba event and the difficult years that followed. The people living here adapted, innovated, survived. They developed new technologies, new strategies for extracting food from their environment. Other researchers suggest additional refuges might have existed. Perhaps in East Africa, in areas where reliable water sources and diverse ecosystems provided sufficient resources. Perhaps in Central Africa, in regions that maintain their forest cover despite the cooling. What's becoming clear is that survival wasn't uniform. It wasn't a matter of all humans everywhere struggling equally. Instead, some populations in some locations had access to resources and conditions that allowed them to persist. Other populations in less favorable locations dwindled and disappeared. This creates an interesting paradox. The very disaster that nearly destroyed humanity also set the stage for everything that came after. The surviving populations, concentrated in specific refuges, developed new adaptations, new technologies, new cultural practices. When conditions improved and populations began to expand again, they carried these innovations with them. In a very real sense, the bottleneck shaped what it means to be human. The strategies that allowed survival during the darkest time became part of our species' toolkit. The innovations born of desperation became the foundation for future success. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how people actually survived. What did daily life look like for the generation that endured? What did they eat? Where did they live? How did they organize themselves? To answer these questions, we need to descend to human scale, to imagine ourselves as one of those survivors, living through the long winter at the edge of the world. You wake before dawn. The darkness is complete, broken only by the faint glow of stars through the cave entrance. Beside you, your family sleeps, huddled close for warmth. The air is cool, unusually so for this time of year. It has been this way for as long as you can remember, though the elders speak of warmer times before. Outside the cave, the wind moves through sparse vegetation. Once, the elders say, this area was lusher, greener. Now the plants are different, smaller, tougher. The animals are fewer too. Hunting requires more effort, longer journeys, more patience. Nothing comes easily anymore. This is life at the edge of extinction, though you don't think of it that way. You think only of today's challenges. Finding food. Keeping warm. Staying alive. Tomorrow is too far away to worry about. Survival is measured in days, not years. As gray light begins to filter into the cave, others wake. An old woman, wrinkled and worn but still sharp-eyed, tends the fire. Fire is precious. It must never be allowed to die completely. Starting a new fire requires effort and materials that aren't always available. Better to maintain what you have, feeding it carefully, banking it at night, nurturing the coals back to flame each morning. The fire provides warmth, of course, but also safety. Predators avoid it. At night, when larger animals might otherwise venture close to the cave, the fire keeps them at bay. It also makes food more digestible, kills parasites in meat, allows you to process plants that would be inedible raw. Your group numbers perhaps 40 individuals. 3 or 4 family units, bound together by kinship and necessity. In better times, your people existed in larger numbers, scattered across a wider territory. Now everyone who remains has drawn together. Alone, a single family wouldn't survive. Together, you have enough hands to gather food, watch for danger, care for the young and old. The men gather their weapons. Spears tipped with carefully shaped stone points. Throwing sticks. A few knives made from flaked stone. Each tool represents hours of work, specialized knowledge passed down through generations. The men check their equipment, make repairs where necessary. One man reshapes a spear point that chipped during the last hunt. His movements are practiced, efficient. Waste no material. Every piece of stone is valuable. The women prepare for gathering. They carry bags woven from plant fibers, digging sticks for extracting roots. One woman nurses an infant while checking a collection of snares set the previous day. The snares sometimes catch small animals, a welcome addition to the diet. Today, one holds a rabbit. The woman works quickly to retrieve it, reset the snare for tomorrow. The children, those old enough to help but too young to participate fully in adult work, have their own tasks. They collect firewood, a never-ending necessity. They fetch water from the spring, carrying it in ostrich eggs that have been carefully cleaned and prepared as containers. They watch younger children, keeping them safe and away from danger. You join the men heading out to hunt. The group moves quietly through the landscape, reading signs invisible to untrained eyes. Animal tracks, broken vegetation, scattered droppings. All tell stories about what animals passed this way, when, and where they might be now. The landscape has changed from what it once was. The elders speak of herds so large they darken the plains. Now animals are scattered, wary, harder to approach. You must work for every kill, and many days you return empty-handed. Today, though, you find signs of a small group of antelope. The tracks are fresh, perhaps only hours old. The men confer quietly, making plans. Hunting requires coordination, communication, strategy. You're not faster than the antelope. Your teeth aren't as sharp as a lion's. But you can think, plan, work together. This is your advantage. The hunt takes hours. You track the animals patiently, gradually closing the distance. When you're close enough, the men spread out, trying to position themselves to cut off the antelope's escape routes. The actual kill attempt happens quickly. Spears fly. One finds its mark, striking an animal in the flank. It's not a killing blow, but it wounds the animal, slows it. Now begins the persistence hunt. You follow the wounded antelope, keeping pressure on it, preventing it from stopping to rest. Hours pass. The sun climbs toward its peak. You're tired, thirsty, but you cannot stop. The injured animal is tiring too, weakening from blood loss and exertion. Finally, after following for most of the day, you catch up to it. A final spear throw brings it down. There's no celebration, no waste of energy. The work of butchering begins immediately. Every usable part of the animal is carefully extracted. Meat is cut into portions that can be carried. Organs, rich in nutrients, are eaten first, before they spoil. The hide is carefully removed, will be processed later for use. Bones are broken to extract marrow, a valuable source of fat and calories. By the time you return to the cave, the sun is setting. The women and children have returned earlier from their gathering. They bring roots, tubers, some berries from a rare bush that still fruits. Not as much as they might have found in better times, but enough. Combined with the meat from the hunt, there will be food for several days. The evening gathering around the fire is the heart of social life. Food is shared according to complex rules of kinship and reciprocity. Those who participated in the hunt receive portions, but so do those who were too young or too old to participate. Those who gathered plant foods share their finds. Everyone contributes what they can, receives according to need. As people eat, they talk. Plans are made for tomorrow. A tool that needs repairing is discussed. Someone mentions that the spring seems to be flowing less strongly than before, might need to find an alternate water source soon. Another mentions seeing signs of another group of humans in the distance, suggests maintaining vigilance. Stories are told too, especially for the benefit of the children. Stories about ancestors, about the formation of the world, about proper behavior and important knowledge. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're education, cultural transmission, the glue that binds the group together. An old man speaks of a time before the long cooling, when food was more abundant and the group was larger. Some of the younger people have never known anything but scarcity, can barely imagine such times. But the old man insists it was real, that better times might come again. You don't know if he's right. You know only what you see around you. A harsh world, scarce resources, constant struggle. But you also know that your people have survived this long. Each day you make it through is a small victory. Each child born is hope for the future. As the fire burns low and people settle for sleep, you look up at the stars through the cave entrance. The same stars your ancestors watched, the same stars your children will watch if you manage to keep them alive. You don't know that you're part of a bottleneck, that the entire future of your species depends on groups like yours surviving just a little bit longer. You know only that tomorrow will bring new challenges, and you'll face them as you've faced every challenge so far. With knowledge, skill, cooperation, and stubborn determination not to disappear. This is how humanity survived. Not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through daily persistence, through sharing and cooperation, through passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Through the accumulated wisdom of the old and the adaptability of the young. Through treating each day as what it is, another chance to continue. The caves along the southern coast of Africa hold secrets written in layers of sediment and ancient refuse. Here, in sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of continuous human occupation through the period of the Toba catastrophe and beyond. The story these caves tell is one of adaptation, innovation, and ultimately, survival. Why the coast? Why did this region serve as a refuge when other areas became uninhabitable? The answer lies in the unique characteristics of coastal environments. Unlike inland areas, which depend heavily on seasonal rains and migrating animals, coasts offer year-round resources. The ocean is a constant provider. Imagine standing on the shore 70,000 years ago. The sea level is lower than today, perhaps 60 to 80 meters lower, because so much water is locked up in ice sheets at higher latitudes. This means the coastline extends further out, exposing areas that are now underwater. These exposed areas create tidal zones rich with life. Tidal pools form among the rocks. Twice each day, the tide goes out, leaving behind pools filled with marine life. Shellfish cling to rocks. Crabs scuttle between crevices. Small fish are trapped in shallow water. All of this is food, available predictably, requiring no complex hunting strategy to obtain. The people who lived here developed a deep knowledge of the tides, of the cycles of the moon that govern them. They knew when the tide would be lowest, when the richest pools would be accessible. They knew which shellfish were safe to eat, which to avoid. They knew the seasons when certain species would be most abundant. Archaeological evidence shows extensive use of marine resources. Shell middens, ancient trash heaps composed primarily of discarded shells, accumulate in layers in the caves. These middens are like time capsules. The species present, the sizes of the shells, even the layers themselves tell us about how people lived. The shells show us what people ate, but they tell us more than that. Some shells show signs of being used as tools or containers. Others have holes drilled through them, suggesting they were used as beads for decoration or personal adornment. This is evidence of symbolic thought, of aesthetic sense, of culture beyond mere survival. In the Blombos Cave, archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre, a red iron oxide mineral. These ochre pieces weren't just raw material. They had been deliberately shaped, ground down, carved with geometric patterns. This is art, abstract design, created 75,000 years ago. It's evidence of minds like ours, capable of symbolic thought, aesthetic expression, cultural transmission. Think about what it means to create art during a time of crisis. When resources are scarce, when survival is uncertain, why spend time and effort on something that doesn't directly contribute to getting food or shelter? Yet humans did exactly this. The ochre engravings suggest that even in the darkest times, people maintained their cultural practices, their sense of identity, their connection to something beyond immediate survival. The coastal refuge supported relatively complex culture. People made sophisticated tools, including blades struck from carefully prepared stone cores. This technology, called the still bay industry by archaeologists, shows advanced understanding of stone working. The blades were thin, sharp, efficient. Some were hafted onto wooden shafts to create spears. Others served as cutting tools, knives, scrapers. But it wasn't just stone tools. Evidence suggests people used bone tools as well. Bone can be carved and shaped in ways that stone cannot, creating tools with specific shapes for specific purposes. Bone points could be used as awls for working hides. Bone hooks might have been used for fishing, though direct evidence of this is scarce. The use of marine resources had profound implications. Shellfish and other marine foods are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, nutrients that are crucial for brain development. Some researchers have suggested that the exploitation of marine resources during this period might have contributed to cognitive development, to the final emergence of fully modern human behavior and cognition. Whether or not diet directly influenced brain development, what's clear is that the people living in the coastal refuge were behaviorally modern. They had language, complex enough to transmit detailed knowledge across generations. They had art and symbolism. They had technology that required planning and skill to create. They had social structures complex enough to regulate resource sharing and maintain group cohesion. The caves themselves offered protection. Not just from weather, though that was important, but from predators. A cave with a defendable entrance could be made relatively safe. Fire at the entrance would deter most animals. A group of humans with weapons could defend against those that weren't deterred. Living in caves also allowed people to accumulate possessions, to store things. Without permanent shelter, everything must be portable. You can only own what you can carry. But in a cave, you can store extra tools, hides, dried food. This allows for more specialization, more investment in creating quality tools, more stability. The population in the coastal refuge was probably small. Perhaps a few thousand individuals distributed along hundreds of kilometers of coastline. Groups might have been separated by considerable distances, but they weren't completely isolated. Evidence of similar tool types across different sites suggests contact, exchange of ideas if not of goods. Marriage patterns would have required some contact between groups. Small, isolated populations face problems with inbreeding. To maintain genetic health, young people from different groups need to meet, form partnerships, exchange genes. This probably happened during seasonal gatherings, times when multiple groups came together at particularly rich locations. These gatherings would have been important socially and culturally as well. They would have allowed for exchange of information, of stories, of innovations. A new tool technology developed by one group could spread to others. Social bonds could be formed that would facilitate cooperation during difficult times. But life in the refuge wasn't easy. Even with access to marine resources, survival required constant effort, detailed knowledge, careful planning. The evidence shows that people didn't just passively collect shellfish. They actively managed their resources, understanding concepts like sustainable harvesting long before those terms existed. Studies of the shell middens show that people preferentially harvested larger, mature shellfish while leaving smaller ones to grow. This isn't accidental. It's evidence of planning, of understanding that if you harvest everything, there won't be anything left for next time. It's evidence of groups that expected to stay in one area long-term, that had a vested interest in maintaining resource availability. The climate during this period, even in the refuge, was harsher than today. Cooler, drier, less predictable. The plant resources that people depended on, particularly in inland areas, would have been less abundant. But the coast buffered the worst effects. The ocean moderates temperature extremes. Coastal areas tend to receive more consistent moisture from fog and sea breezes. Still, there would have been years when resources failed. When shellfish were scarce, when fish didn't come to the coast in expected numbers, when the limited plant resources inland were insufficient. In those years, mortality would have spiked. The population would have declined. Only in average or good years could it recover. This is the pattern we see in the archaeological record. Occupation layers showing intensive use of caves alternating with layers showing reduced occupation or even temporary abandonment. The population fluctuated, expanding in good times, contracting in bad. But crucially, it never disappeared completely. Always, some group hung on, survived, maintained the thread of human presence in the region. And slowly, gradually, conditions began to improve. The volcanic winter ended. Temperatures recovered. Rainfall patterns stabilized. The inland areas began to support more plant and animal life. The crisis wasn't over. The bottleneck would persist for thousands of years yet, but the very worst had passed. The population in the coastal refuge began to grow. Not rapidly, not explosively, but steadily. More children survived to adulthood. More food allowed people to live longer, to remain healthy enough to reproduce. The genetic bottleneck began, slowly, to ease. But even as population grew, the refuge had limits. The coast could only support so many people. Eventually, some groups began to move inland, to explore territories that had been abandoned or marginally inhabited during the worst times. These movements set the stage for the next chapter in human history, the expansion out of Africa, the colonization of the world. Inside every cell of your body is a library of information. Your DNA contains not just the instructions for building and maintaining you, but also a record of your ancestry stretching back thousands of generations. By reading this record, scientists can reconstruct the history of our species with remarkable detail. The story written in our genes is clear. All modern humans are closely related. Remarkably closely related. If you compare the DNA of two people chosen randomly from anywhere on Earth, they'll be more similar than two chimpanzees from the same forest. This seems counterintuitive. Humans look different from each other. We have different skin colors, different features, different builds. How can we be so genetically similar? The answer is that we all descend from a small population that lived relatively recently in evolutionary terms. The genetic diversity we see today, all the variation in our species, accumulated after this bottleneck event. Before the bottleneck, there was more diversity. But most of that diversity was lost when the population crashed. Think of it like this. Imagine a bag containing 1,000 marbles of many different colors and patterns. Now imagine reaching in and pulling out just 10 marbles. Those 10 marbles will capture some of the variation from the original collection, but much will be lost. The rare colors, the unusual patterns, most of those are left behind. This is what happened to human genetic diversity. Before the bottleneck, there were many genetic variants in the human population. But when the population crashed to just a few thousand individuals, most of those variants were lost. Only the variants present in the surviving population could be passed to future generations. We can see evidence of this bottleneck in multiple ways. One of the clearest is in mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria are the energy-producing structures in your cells, and they have their own small genome, separate from the DNA in your cell nucleus. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child without recombination. This means it's inherited as a unit, making it relatively simple to trace lineages. When scientists analyze mitochondrial DNA from people all over the world, they find something remarkable. All modern humans share mitochondrial DNA that traces back to a woman who lived in Africa roughly 70 to 80,000 years ago. Scientists call her mitochondrial Eve, though this name is somewhat misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She wasn't even necessarily special in any way. She's simply the most recent common ancestor of all modern humans through the maternal line. Other women lived alongside her, but their mitochondrial lineages eventually died out. Her lineage, through chance and survival, is the only one that persists in modern populations. Similarly, analysis of Y chromosome DNA, which passes from father to son, points to a recent common ancestor for all modern males. This Y chromosome atom lived sometime in a similar time frame, though dating is less precise. Again, he wasn't the only man alive, just the only one whose Y chromosome lineage survives today. These findings tell us that the human population went through a severe bottleneck, a period when it was very small. The exact size is difficult to determine. Different analytical methods give different results. Some estimates suggest the effective population size dropped to as low as 1 to 2,000 breeding individuals. Other estimates are higher, perhaps 10,000 individuals. An effective population size is a technical concept. It doesn't mean the total number of people alive, but rather the number of people who were actually contributing genes to the next generation. The actual population might have been larger, but only a fraction were breeding adults. Even taking the higher estimates, these are extraordinarily small numbers for a species distributed across an entire continent. Many endangered species today have larger populations. If an ecologist from the future looked at the genetic evidence without knowing humans survived, they might conclude we should have gone extinct. But we didn't go extinct. We survived and eventually thrived. The question is how? Part of the answer lies in the structure of human populations during the bottleneck. We weren't distributed evenly across Africa. We were concentrated in refuges, areas where conditions were survivable. This concentration actually helps survival in some ways. It allows for more interactions between individuals, more opportunities for mating, more sharing of innovations and knowledge. The genetic evidence also tells us about population structure during this period. There appear to have been multiple populations in Africa, partially isolated from each other but with some gene flow between them. These populations had slightly different genetic signatures, suggesting they'd been separated for some time but not completely isolated. This makes sense given what we know about African geography. Mountains, deserts, and rivers create natural barriers that can partially separate populations while still allowing occasional contact. During the bottleneck period, these partial barriers would have been even more significant as populations declined and territorial ranges contracted. Some researchers have suggested that the bottleneck might not have been as severe as the most dramatic scenarios suggest. They point out that genetic diversity in some regions, particularly in southern Africa, is higher than would be expected from a single, catastrophic population crash. This could mean either that the population didn't drop quite as low as the lowest estimates suggest, or that recovery began earlier in some areas. There's also the question of other human species. At the time of the Toba event, modern humans weren't alone. Neanderthals inhabited Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans lived in Eastern Asia. There were possibly other archaic human populations in various regions. What happened to them during this period? Some of these populations also show signs of population stress around this time, though the evidence is less clear than for modern humans. Neanderthals survived the Toba event, but their population appears to have been structured into small, partially isolated groups. When modern humans later expanded out of Africa, they encountered these Neanderthal populations and interbred with them to a limited degree. Today, most non-African people carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. This tells us that interbreeding occurred, probably in the Middle East as modern humans first left Africa. Similarly, some populations carry small amounts of Denisovan DNA, evidence of interbreeding in Asia. But these are minor contributions. The vast majority of our genetic heritage comes from the African populations that survived the bottleneck. We are essentially all Africans. The variation we see in modern populations, the adaptations to different climates and environments, these all evolved after the bottleneck, after humans began expanding out of Africa and into new environments. The bottleneck left other signatures in our genome as well. Some genetic variants that might have been rare before the bottleneck became more common simply by chance. Other variants were lost entirely. This random process, called genetic drift, is particularly strong in small populations. Some of the genes that became more common might have been advantageous during the bottleneck period. They might have helped with survival under harsh conditions. Other genes that became common might have been neutral or even mildly deleterious, but survived simply by being present in the small population that made it through. This has implications for human health today. Some genetic diseases are more common than we might expect because the variants that cause them happened to be present in bottleneck populations. They weren't necessarily advantageous, but they weren't lethal enough to be eliminated, and once they became common in the small population, they remained common even as the population expanded. But the bottleneck also shaped us in positive ways. The shared genetic heritage of humanity means we're all fundamentally similar. Despite surface differences in appearance, all humans are interfertile, all capable of learning any language, all possessing the same basic cognitive abilities. The genetic differences between human populations are minor compared to the genetic similarities. This shared heritage from the bottleneck period is written in every cell of your body. The genes that code for your basic physiology, your brain structure, your immune system, these are all descended from the small population that survived 70,000 years ago. You carry their legacy, their adaptations, their survival strategies. In a very real sense, every human alive today is related. We're all cousins, separated by perhaps 2,000 generations, but family nonetheless. The next time you see another person, remember, you share ancestors who survived the bottleneck together. Your lineages diverged sometime in the past few thousand years, but trace them back far enough and they meet in a small group of people clinging to survival in Africa. The years immediately following the Toba catastrophe brought changes that extended far beyond mere survival. The crisis forced innovation. When traditional methods of obtaining food became insufficient, people had to adapt, to experiment, to try new approaches. From this necessity came technologies and behaviors that would define modern humans. Consider the problem of protein. Meat is crucial for human nutrition, providing not just protein but also fats, vitamins, and minerals difficult to obtain from plant sources alone. But large game animals, the traditional targets of human hunting, had become scarce. The populations of antelope, buffalo, and other herbivores had declined along with the vegetation they depended on. Smaller animals remained, but they present different challenges. A rabbit won't feed a group the way an antelope will. You need to catch many more small animals to get equivalent nutrition. This requires different hunting strategies, different tools, different approaches. Archaeological evidence from this period shows innovation in hunting technology. People developed new types of projectile points, smaller and more refined than earlier versions. These points were designed for throwing spears or atlatls, tools that increase the velocity and range of a thrown spear. With these innovations, hunters could target smaller, faster animals more effectively. But the most significant innovation might have been the bow and arrow, though the archaeological evidence for early bows is limited because wood rarely survives. Still, the appearance of very small, specialized stone points around this time suggests projectile technology beyond hand-thrown spears. A bow allows for silent, accurate hunting of small game at distances that would be impossible with throwing spears. Fishing also becomes more important during this period. The coastal populations already exploited marine resources heavily, but evidence suggests they developed more sophisticated fishing technologies. Bone hooks appear in the archaeological record. Nets, though they don't preserve, were probably used as well, woven from plant fibers. Fishing represents a different relationship with food acquisition than hunting. Hunting is active, requiring you to find and pursue animals. Fishing can be more passive. Set a hook and line, check it later. Set a trap in a tidal pool, return when the tide goes out. This allows for more efficient use of time and energy. The gathering of plant foods also became more sophisticated. Evidence suggests people were not just collecting wild plants but actively managing them. Burning areas to encourage new growth. Protecting certain plants from animal predation. Perhaps even beginning the very earliest forms of cultivation, though true agriculture was still thousands of years in the future. Root vegetables became particularly important. Tubers that grow underground are less affected by surface climate conditions than above-ground plants. They store well, can be collected and transported. But many tubers are toxic when raw and must be processed to be edible. This requires knowledge, developed through trial and error, passed down through generations. Processing toxic plants involves various techniques. Some tubers must be roasted extensively to break down toxins. Others must be ground up and leached in water for days. Still others require fermenting. Each plant species has its own processing requirements, its own preparation techniques. The people who survived the bottleneck possessed encyclopedic knowledge of which plants were edible and how to prepare them. This knowledge was transmitted culturally through teaching and demonstration. Children learned by watching adults, by practicing under supervision. A girl would watch her mother select tubers, prepare them, cook them. She would learn which plants to avoid, which to gather, how to tell if they were ready to harvest. Boys learned hunting and tool-making from fathers and other adult males. A boy would accompany hunts from a young age, first just watching, then helping with simple tasks, gradually taking on more responsibility. He would learn to read tracks, to understand animal behavior, to use weapons effectively. He would learn tool-making, the patient process of turning raw stone into functional implements. But both boys and girls needed broader knowledge as well. Everyone needed to know about the environment, about seasons and weather patterns, about the locations of resources. Everyone needed to understand the social rules of the group, the kinship relationships, the protocols for sharing and cooperation. Language made this transmission of knowledge possible. The humans of this period spoke complex languages, capable of expressing abstract concepts, hypothetical situations, distant events. Language allowed people to share knowledge that exceeded any individual's direct experience. An elder could describe a drought that happened before a young person was born, preparing them for similar events in the future. Language also enabled planning and coordination. A group of hunters could discuss strategy before a hunt, assign roles, agree on signals. A group deciding whether to migrate could debate the options, share information about different territories, reach consensus on a course of action. The social structures of these groups were complex. They weren't simple hierarchies with one leader making all decisions. Leadership was probably situational, with different individuals taking charge depending on the task. The best hunter might lead a hunt, but someone else might be more respected for knowledge of plants or skill at resolving disputes. Kinship networks structured group relationships. Who you were related to determined your position in the group, your responsibilities, your access to resources. These weren't rigid rules but flexible guidelines, adapted to circumstances. In a small group where everyone is related to everyone else in multiple ways, kinship creates a web of mutual obligations and support. Marriage practices ensured connections between groups. In such small populations, marrying within your immediate group too often would lead to inbreeding problems. So mechanisms existed, culturally enforced, to encourage marriage between groups. Young women might leave their birth group to join their husband's group, or vice versa. These marriages created alliances, facilitated trade and information exchange. Art and symbolism become more elaborate during this period. Personal ornaments, beads made from shells or stones, appear with increasing frequency in the archaeological record. These ornaments served multiple purposes. They indicated group membership, displayed personal identity, marked status or achievement. Body decoration, though it doesn't preserve archaeologically, was probably important as well. Ochre, that red pigment found at sites like Blombo's cave, was likely used for body painting. Different patterns could indicate different things: group affiliation, age, status, ceremonial role. Music might have existed, though direct evidence is limited. Bone flutes from this approximate period have been found, suggesting people made musical instruments. Even without instruments, humans have voices, can create rhythms by clapping or stamping. Music serves social functions, brings groups together, facilitates bonding and cooperation. Ritual and ceremony probably played important roles in social life. Ceremonies mark transitions: birth, coming of age, marriage, death. They reinforce group identity, teach cultural values, provide structure to life's uncertainties. The exact nature of these ceremonies is lost to time, but evidence of symbolic behavior suggests they existed. Burial practices show evolution during this period. Earlier humans sometimes buried their dead, but burials from around the time of the bottleneck show more deliberate arrangement, sometimes with grave goods. This suggests beliefs about death and possibly an afterlife, though we can only speculate about specific beliefs. What we can say with confidence is that the humans who survived the bottleneck possessed fully modern cognitive abilities. They thought symbolically, planned for the future, created art, transmitted complex cultural knowledge. In their minds, they were as sophisticated as any modern human. The main difference was the knowledge base they worked from, the technologies available to them, not their fundamental capacity for thought. Innovation during this crisis period laid groundwork for future developments. Technologies developed under pressure would be refined and improved in better times. Cultural practices that promoted cooperation and knowledge sharing became deeply embedded in human societies. The adaptability that allowed survival through the bottleneck became a defining characteristic of our species. Recovery from a near-extinction event doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds gradually, across many generations, dependent on countless factors aligning favorably. For the human population following the Toba catastrophe, recovery was measured not in years or decades but in millennia. The immediate aftermath, as we've discussed, was characterized by small, scattered populations clinging to favorable refuges. For thousands of years, perhaps 5,000 or more, the human population remained low. Growth was slow, punctuated by setbacks when conditions deteriorated temporarily. But slowly, imperceptibly to those living through it, conditions improved. The volcanic winter fully cleared. Global climate began stabilizing. The temperature remained cooler than pre-Toba levels for many thousands of years, but it was no longer deteriorating. Plant communities adjusted to the new conditions. Animal populations began recovering. The ecological damage slowly healed. For human populations, this meant gradually improving circumstances. Food became more available, not suddenly or dramatically, but in small increments. A slightly higher success rate in hunting. fruiting trees that produced more reliably, water sources that flowed more consistently. Each small improvement increased survival rates slightly. Population growth in small groups follows particular patterns. When a group has sufficient resources, women tend to have children at shorter intervals. Better nutrition improves fertility, reduces complications during pregnancy and childbirth, increases the likelihood that children survive to adulthood. In the harshest conditions of the bottleneck period, a woman might have 4 or 5 children in her lifetime, but only 2 might survive to adulthood. This results in stable or declining population. But as conditions improve, survival rates increase. If 3 children survive, or 4, then population begins growing. The growth is slow, especially in the beginning. A 2% growth rate, which sounds modest, would double a population in 35 years. But that assumes consistent growth, which probably didn't happen. More likely, growth occurred in pulses during favorable periods, offset by declines during difficult periods. Gradually, though, the overall trend was upward. Groups that had numbered 20 or 30 individuals grew to 40 or 50. They split, forming daughter groups that moved into adjacent territories. These daughter groups grew in turn, split again. Like water slowly spreading across a surface, human populations expanded into available ecological niches. The coastal refuges, which had sustained humanity through the worst times, began to feel constrained. The coast offered abundant resources, but it was a limited environment. There's only so much coastline, only so many caves, only so many tidal pools. As population grew, groups had to either intensify their use of coastal resources or expand into other environments. Some groups chose intensification. They developed more sophisticated methods for harvesting marine resources, allowing more people to live on the same stretch of coast. But there are limits to intensification. Eventually, the coast reached carrying capacity, could support no more people without degradation of resources. Other groups chose expansion. They moved inland, into areas that had been abandoned or sparsely inhabited during the bottleneck period. This required adaptation. Inland environments differ from coastal ones. The food sources are different, water is less reliably available, the seasonal patterns vary. Groups moving inland had to modify their strategies, develop new knowledge. But humans are adaptable. We evolved in diverse African environments, from forests to savannas to semi-arid regions. The knowledge of how to live in these environments still existed in cultural memory, even if groups had been constrained to coastal areas for generations. The basics of hunting savanna game, of finding water in dry landscapes, of processing savanna plants, these could be relearned or transmitted from groups that had maintained inland presence. Archaeological evidence shows expansion into the interior of southern Africa beginning perhaps 60 to 65,000 years ago. Sites that had been abandoned show reoccupation. New sites, in areas previously uninhabited by humans, show first occupation. The human footprint was expanding. This expansion created opportunities for innovation. New environments present new challenges, requiring new solutions. Groups moving into arid areas developed better strategies for finding and storing water. Groups moving into forested areas developed technologies for hunting in denser vegetation. Each environment selected for particular innovations. Trade networks probably began expanding during this period as well. Groups in different environments had access to different resources. A coastal group had abundant shellfish and could harvest marine resources. An inland group had access to certain types of stone useful for tools or particular plant materials. Exchange of resources benefited both groups. Trade in stone is particularly visible in the archaeological record. Certain types of stone, those that fracture predictably and can be shaped into high-quality tools, are relatively rare. They occur in specific geological formations. Groups with access to good stone sources could trade it to groups without such access. But trade was probably about more than just material goods. It was also about social connections, about maintaining relationships between groups that might need to cooperate in the future. A trade relationship could become a marriage alliance, could facilitate cooperation during conflicts, could provide refuge if one group faced disaster. As population grew and expanded, social complexity increased. Larger populations and more extensive interaction networks required more sophisticated social structures. Mechanisms for resolving disputes became more important. Common languages, or at least mutual intelligibility, facilitated interaction. Shared cultural practices helped maintain group identity while allowing cooperation with other groups. It's during this period of recovery that we see the emergence of behaviors and technologies that archaeologists associate with fully modern humans. Long-distance trade in valuable materials. Sophisticated art and symbolism. Standardized tool types suggesting cultural traditions. Evidence of planning and foresight in resource use. Some researchers argue that these behaviors represent a cognitive revolution, a sudden emergence of modern human thinking. But the evidence suggests continuity rather than sudden change. The behaviors emerge gradually, building on earlier foundations. The crisis of the bottleneck period might have accelerated some developments, creating selective pressure for innovation and cooperation, but it didn't fundamentally change human cognitive abilities. What did change was population size and density. As more people lived in closer proximity, as interaction networks expanded, the pace of cultural innovation increased. Ideas could spread more easily. Innovations developed by one group could be adopted by others. Cultural evolution began accelerating. By 60,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, the human population in Africa had recovered substantially from the bottleneck. Tens of thousands of individuals, maybe 100,000 or more, spread across the southern and eastern parts of the continent. Population density was still low by modern standards, but the crisis had passed. Humanity was no longer teetering on the edge of extinction. But the legacy of the bottleneck persisted in human genetics. The low diversity established during the crisis period would characterize humanity going forward. All the variation we see in modern populations, all the adaptations to different environments, all the physical differences between populations, these accumulated after the bottleneck, built on the limited genetic variation of the surviving population. And as population recovered in Africa, some groups began looking beyond the continent. To the north, across the narrow gap where the Red Sea could be crossed, lay Arabia, and beyond it, Asia. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in human history, the expansion out of Africa and the colonization of the entire planet. The decision to leave a familiar territory and venture into the unknown is never made lightly. For the early humans contemplating movement out of Africa, this wasn't a grand plan or coordinated expedition. It was small groups making individual decisions, following resources, exploring new areas, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing. The primary route out of Africa appears to have been through the Middle East. At various times during the past 100,000 years, climate fluctuations made this crossing easier or harder. During wetter periods, the Sahara and Arabian deserts retreated, replaced by grasslands with adequate water sources. During dry periods, these regions became barriers, impassable to humans without sophisticated water storage technology. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, conditions became favorable for movement northward. The genetic evidence suggests that the main expansion out of Africa, the one that led to colonization of the entire planet, occurred around this time. This wasn't the first time humans had left Africa. Earlier groups had ventured into the Middle East, but they either went extinct or left no genetic legacy in modern populations. This time was different. This time, the population had recovered enough to support sustained expansion. This time, the groups that left carried with them the full behavioral modernity that emerged during and after the bottleneck. They had sophisticated tools, complex language, rich cultural knowledge. They were prepared to adapt to new environments. The initial movement was probably coastal. Following shorelines provides natural navigation, reliable access to water, and consistent food sources. Groups that had survived the bottleneck in coastal refuges already possessed knowledge of marine resource exploitation. Applying this knowledge as they moved into new territories gave them an advantage. Imagine being part of a group deciding to move beyond familiar territory. You've heard stories, perhaps, from travelers or distant relatives, about lands to the north. Maybe drought or conflict has made your current territory less desirable. Maybe simple curiosity drives you. Whatever the reason, your group begins moving. The journey wouldn't be rapid or direct. You move short distances, perhaps just a few kilometers, then stop to exploit local resources. If an area proves rich, you might stay for weeks or months before moving on. If resources are scarce, you move more quickly. Over years or generations, this gradual expansion carries you far from your starting point. The Arabian Peninsula during favorable climatic periods was not the desert it is today. Archaeological evidence shows it was grassland, dotted with lakes and rivers. Animals grazed across it. Plants grew in abundance. For humans with appropriate knowledge and tools, it was perfectly habitable. From Arabia, routes led in multiple directions. East toward the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean coast. North toward the Levant and beyond into Europe and Central Asia. Each route presented different opportunities and challenges. Groups split, some following one path, others another. The coastal route along the Indian Ocean appears to have been particularly important. Following this route, humans reached South Asia and Southeast Asia relatively quickly. Genetic evidence and archaeological finds suggest humans were in Southeast Asia and Australia by 60,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This represents an extraordinary achievement. Reaching Australia from Southeast Asia required crossing open water, even during periods of low sea level when more land bridges existed. This means humans developed watercraft capable of ocean crossings, navigation skills sufficient to aim for distant shores, and the courage to venture into the unknown. The boats were probably simple rafts or dugout canoes. The voyages were probably short, island hopping rather than long-distance crossings. But still, this required technology and planning beyond anything necessary for inland travel. It suggests sophisticated problem-solving, careful preparation, willingness to take risks. Each new environment humans entered required adaptation. The tropical forests of Southeast Asia differ dramatically from African savannas. New plants, new animals, new challenges. But humans proved remarkably adaptable. Within a few thousand years of arriving in a new region, populations had developed specialized tools and strategies suited to local conditions. In colder climates, clothing became essential. Animal hides, carefully prepared and stitched together, provided insulation. Fire became even more critical for survival, not just for cooking but for warmth. Shelter needed to provide better protection from elements than simple windbreaks or caves. The megafauna of new continents presented both opportunities and challenges. In Eurasia, humans encountered mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, cave bears. These animals were enormous, dangerous, but also represented huge amounts of meat and materials if successfully hunted. Humans developed specialized strategies for hunting megafauna, including coordinated drives and sophisticated traps. Not all encounters with other species were about hunting. Wolves began a process of domestication during this period, eventually becoming dogs. This wasn't deliberate breeding but rather a gradual process of mutual adaptation. Wolves that were less fearful of humans could scavenge from human camps. Humans who tolerated these wolves gained warning systems against predators and assistance in hunting. Over generations, the relationship became symbiotic, eventually producing domestic dogs. As humans spread across Eurasia, they encountered other human species. Neanderthals had inhabited Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were well adapted to Ice Age conditions, skilled hunters, capable of complex thought. When modern humans expanded into Neanderthal territory, the two species coexisted for thousands of years. The relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals is complex. There was definitely some interbreeding, we know this from genetic evidence. But the details are murky. Were they competitors, fighting over resources? Were they separate populations that occasionally encountered each other peacefully? Did they have extensive cultural exchange? Or was contact limited? What's clear is that eventually, Neanderthals went extinct, probably around 40,000 years ago. Whether modern humans contributed to this extinction through competition, disease, or violence, or whether it was coincidental timing, remains debated. But the genetic legacy persists. Most people of non-African ancestry carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of ancient interbreeding. Similarly, in Eastern Asia, modern humans encountered Denisovans, another archaic human species known primarily from genetic evidence and a handful of fossils. There was interbreeding here too, leaving genetic signatures in some modern populations, particularly in Oceania. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans had spread across most of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Populations adapted to environments from tropical forests to Arctic tundra. Cultural diversity began developing as populations in different regions adapted to different conditions, innovated different solutions, developed different traditions. The Americas remained unpeopled by humans, separated by vast oceans and ice sheets. Australia and New Guinea had been reached but remained isolated, their populations developing independently. But the foundation was laid. Humans had proven capable of adapting to nearly any environment Earth offered. The bottleneck population, those few thousand individuals who survived in African refuges, had given rise to populations now numbering in the hundreds of thousands or more, spread across 3 continents. Their genes, their innovations, their cultural knowledge, had seeded the entire human expansion. By 30,000 years ago, humans had become a global species in nearly every sense. From tropical islands to frozen tundra, from dense forests to open grasslands, human populations had adapted to almost every available environment. But the story of expansion wasn't finished. The Americas still waited, vast and empty of human presence. The peopling of the Americas represents the final major chapter in human geographic expansion. It required specific conditions: a route across from Asia, sufficient population pressure to drive exploration, and the technology to survive in harsh environments. The route existed in the form of Beringia, the land bridge that periodically connected Asia and North America during periods of low sea level. When ice sheets locked up enough water, the Bering Strait was exposed land, 1,000 kilometers wide, connecting Siberia to Alaska. This wasn't a narrow crossing but a substantial landmass, supporting its own ecosystems and animal populations. The timing of human entry into the Americas remains debated. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests the main colonization occurred between 15 and 20,000 years ago, though some evidence points to possibly earlier dates. People adapted to the harsh conditions of northeastern Asia, with sophisticated cold-weather clothing and hunting strategies, could have moved into Beringia following game animals. From Beringia, the path south was initially blocked by massive ice sheets covering much of Canada. But around 15,000 years ago, as the Ice Age began ending, routes opened. Either a coastal route along the Pacific, or an ice-free corridor through the interior, or both, allowed movement into the heart of North America. Once south of the ice sheets, humans found a continent rich with resources. Megafauna that had never encountered human hunters were naive, easy prey. Enormous herds of mammoth, mastodon, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and countless other species filled the landscape. The abundance of game supported rapid population growth and expansion. Within perhaps just a couple thousand years, humans spread from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. This represents an expansion rate of roughly a kilometer per year averaged over the entire period. In reality, movement was probably more rapid, with populations establishing themselves and then daughter groups leapfrogging ahead to settle new territories. The Americas developed their own distinct human cultures. Without contact with populations in Africa, Europe, or Asia, American populations evolved independently. They developed different tools, different artistic traditions, different social structures. Yet fundamentally, they remained human with the same cognitive abilities, the same capacity for innovation and adaptation. In South America, humans adapted to the Amazon rainforest, developing sophisticated knowledge of tropical plants and animals. In the Andes, they learned to thrive at high altitudes with thin air and cold temperatures. In the grasslands of North America, they became specialized hunters of bison and other plains animals. The megafauna of the Americas didn't survive long after human arrival. Within a few thousand years, most large animal species went extinct. Whether humans were primarily responsible through hunting, or whether climate change was the main driver, or some combination, remains debated. But the correlation between human arrival and extinctions is striking. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, human cultures continued evolving. Agriculture emerged independently in multiple locations around 10 to 12,000 years ago. In the Middle East, people began cultivating wheat and barley. In China, rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash. In New Guinea, taro and other root crops. Agriculture represents a fundamental transformation in human lifestyle. Instead of moving to follow resources, people stayed in one place and brought resources to them. This allowed for larger, denser populations. It created food surpluses that could support specialists who didn't produce food directly, craftspeople, religious leaders, warriors, administrators. But agriculture also brought new challenges. Dense populations facilitated disease transmission. Reliance on a few crops created vulnerability to crop failures. Social inequality increased as some individuals accumulated wealth and power. The archaeological record shows evidence of malnutrition, conflict, and disease increasing in agricultural societies. Despite these challenges, agriculture spread. The advantages of reliable food production and population growth outweighed the disadvantages for most groups. Within a few thousand years, agricultural societies had replaced hunter-gatherers across much of the planet. Cities emerged from agricultural villages. The first cities, in Mesopotamia and other regions, were small by modern standards but revolutionary in concept. Thousands of people living in close proximity, dependent on complex systems of food production and distribution, organized under centralized leadership. With cities came writing, at least in some regions. Writing enabled record-keeping, administration of complex societies, transmission of knowledge across time and space. The earliest writing systems, around 5,000 years ago, were primarily administrative, records of grain stores, tax collection, trade transactions. But writing quickly expanded to encompass other purposes. Religious texts, historical records, literature, poetry, philosophy. The accumulated knowledge of humanity could now be stored outside individual human memory, transmitted to future generations with high fidelity. Metallurgy developed in several regions independently. The ability to work copper, then bronze, then iron, created new tools, weapons, and artistic possibilities. Metal tools were more durable and effective than stone. Metal weapons changed warfare. The wealth and power represented by metal objects drove trade and conflict. Throughout all this cultural and technological evolution, humans remained fundamentally the same species that had survived the bottleneck. Our brains hadn't changed significantly in size or structure for tens of thousands of years. What changed was accumulated knowledge, cultural complexity, population density. A child from the bottleneck period, raised in a modern society, would be indistinguishable from any other modern human. They would learn language, mathematics, art, music, all the skills of contemporary culture. Similarly, a modern child raised in a hunter-gatherer context would adapt to that lifestyle. This demonstrates something crucial about humanity. We're not defined primarily by our individual genetics but by our cultural inheritance. The knowledge, tools, social structures, and traditions we inherit from previous generations shape us as much or more than our DNA. The generation that almost went extinct passed down more than genes. They passed down knowledge, how to make tools, how to find food, how to survive. They passed down language, allowing complex communication and planning. They passed down culture, the shared beliefs and practices that bind groups together. Every subsequent generation built on this foundation. Each innovation, each discovery, each cultural development added to the accumulating heritage of humanity. The process accelerated over time as populations grew and interaction networks expanded. By the time of written history, cultural evolution was proceeding at a pace that dwarfed genetic evolution. Stand before a mirror and look at your reflection. The face looking back is the product of 4 billion years of evolution, of countless generations stretching back to the first life on Earth. But it's also specifically the product of 70,000 years of survival, adaptation, and expansion following humanity's closest brush with extinction. The story of the bottleneck is written throughout your genome. Every cell contains chromosomes that passed through that narrow passage 74,000 years ago. The genes that help you fight disease, that determine your physical traits, that shape your brain and behavior, all of these survive the crisis period. Some of this genetic legacy is visible. The relatively low diversity in human blood types, compared to other primates, reflects the bottleneck. The fact that humans worldwide can receive blood transfusions from each other, despite superficial differences, shows our fundamental similarity. The proteins in your immune system show bottleneck signatures as well. The major histocompatibility complex, crucial for immune function, is less diverse in humans than in most other large mammals. This makes sense when you understand that all modern humans descend from a small population. Only the immune genes present in that population could be passed forward. This reduced diversity has implications. Some infectious diseases affect humans more severely than they might if we had greater immune diversity. On the other hand, our similarity means medical research conducted on diverse populations has broader applicability. A treatment developed for one population is more likely to work for others. Your brain, that 3-pound universe inside your skull, is also a product of the bottleneck period. Not that the bottleneck changed brain structure, it didn't. But the cognitive abilities that allowed survival during the crisis, the capacity for complex planning, sophisticated communication, innovative problem-solving, these were selected for. Language ability, present before the bottleneck, became even more crucial during it. Groups that could communicate effectively, share knowledge, coordinate action, had survival advantages. The genes underlying language ability were strongly selected for. This might explain why language is universal in humans, why every human population has complex language. The tendency toward cooperation, toward forming bonds with non-kin, toward creating complex social structures, these too may have been reinforced during the bottleneck. Small groups surviving in harsh conditions couldn't afford internal conflict. Cooperation was essential. Individuals or groups that failed to cooperate effectively had lower survival rates. Some researchers argue that the bottleneck period saw selection for increased pro-social behavior, for empathy, for the ability to work together toward common goals. The evidence for this is indirect, but it makes intuitive sense. In a crisis where group survival depends on cooperation, genes or cultural practices that promote cooperation would be advantageous. Your capacity for culture, for learning and transmitting complex knowledge, is perhaps the most important legacy of the bottleneck period. Culture allowed rapid adaptation to changing conditions without waiting for genetic evolution. A new tool technology, a better hunting strategy, a more effective way of processing food, these could spread through a population in a single generation. This capacity for culture exists in other animals, but humans take it to an extreme. We're born incredibly helpless, dependent on extended care and teaching. Our brains remain plastic, capable of learning, well into adulthood. We invest enormous time and resources in transmitting knowledge to the next generation. This makes sense in the context of the bottleneck. In a rapidly changing environment where traditional knowledge might become obsolete, flexibility and learning ability are more valuable than rigid instincts. Groups that could adapt their behavior, learn new skills, pass on innovations, survived. Groups that didn't. The modern world is built on this foundation. Every technology you use, from the smartphone in your pocket to the building you're in, represents accumulated cultural knowledge passed down and built upon by countless generations. The scientists who developed modern technology had no greater innate intelligence than people living 70,000 years ago. They simply had access to more accumulated knowledge. In your DNA, you also carry traces of archaic human species. If you're of non-African descent, roughly 1 to 2% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. If you're of Melanesian descent, you also carry Denisovan genes. These fragments are remnants of ancient encounters, when modern humans expanding out of Africa met and interbred with other human species. Some of these archaic genes have been beneficial. Certain Neanderthal genes helped modern humans adapt to cold climates. Others provided advantages in immune function. Natural selection preserved these useful variants while eliminating harmful ones. Today, Specific Neanderthal genes are found at high frequency in modern populations because they confer advantages. Other archaic genes have been problematic. Some Neanderthal variants increase susceptibility to certain diseases. Some affect metabolism in ways that might have been advantageous in the Ice Age but are problematic in modern contexts. The legacy of interbreeding is complex, neither wholly beneficial nor wholly harmful. The bottleneck also left psychological legacies. Some argue that certain aspects of human psychology, our tendency toward in-group favoritism and out-group suspicion, for example, were shaped by the conditions of the bottleneck period. Small groups competing for scarce resources would benefit from strong in-group cohesion and caution toward outsiders. Similarly, our capacity for rapid cultural change, our tendency to adopt innovations, our curiosity about the world, these might have been selected for during the crisis. Groups that could quickly adopt new technologies or strategies had survival advantages. Over generations, this could have selected for psychological traits that promote innovation and cultural learning. But we should be cautious about just so stories that explain every aspect of human psychology as an adaptation to ancestral environments. Human psychology is complex, shaped by many factors over long time periods. The bottleneck was one event, albeit a significant one, in a much longer evolutionary history. What we can say with confidence is that the bottleneck shaped human genetic diversity in ways that persist today. It created a species that is genetically homogeneous compared to other large mammals, yet behaviorally and culturally incredibly diverse. It produced a species with remarkable capacity for cooperation and cultural transmission. Think about the improbability of your existence. Your family line survived the bottleneck, weathered thousands of years of challenges, eventually arriving at the moment of your birth. At every generation, your ancestors faced dangers, disease, violence, accidents, natural disasters. Yet somehow, they survived long enough to reproduce, to pass on their genes to the next generation. This is true for every human alive today. We're all winners of a cosmic lottery, descendants of survivors, inheritors of a genetic and cultural legacy that spans thousands of generations. The obstacles were enormous, the odds of extinction at several points were high, yet here we are. The thread connecting you to those few thousand people huddled in African refuges 70,000 years ago is unbroken. The genes in your cells pass through that bottleneck. The capacity for language, culture, cooperation that you possess developed in part during that crisis period. The very fact that you exist testifies to the resilience and adaptability of your ancestors. We've traveled together through deep time, back to the edge of human extinction and forward to the present. The journey has taken us from volcanic catastrophe through desperate survival to eventual triumph and global expansion. Along the way, we've encountered our ancestors at their most vulnerable and witnessed their remarkable resilience. The story of the generation that almost went extinct is ultimately a story about you, about all of us. We are their descendants, carrying forward the genetic and cultural legacy they preserved through the darkest times. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, can trace our ancestry back to that small population that survived. This shared heritage has profound implications. Despite our superficial differences, despite the diversity of cultures and languages and physical appearances, we're all fundamentally family. The genetic differences between human populations are minor, surface-level variations that accumulated after the bottleneck. Beneath these differences lies deep similarity, written in the genes that passed through the crisis period. Understanding this shared history changes how we see each other. The person you pass on the street, the voice you hear on the news, the stranger in a distant land, all are cousins separated by a few hundred generations at most. We all descend from the same small group of survivors. We all inherit the same capacity for language, culture, cooperation. We all possess the same fundamental human nature. The challenges our ancestors faced during the bottleneck period seem almost unimaginable from our modern perspective. A world growing colder and harsher, food becoming scarce, the population shrinking to thousands or fewer. Yet they endured. Through cooperation, innovation, and stubborn persistence, they refused to go extinct. Their survival strategies, the cultural practices that allowed them to persist, left lasting marks on human nature. Our capacity for cooperation, our ability to share knowledge across generations, our innovative problem-solving, our social complexity, all of these traits were tested and refined during the crisis period. The same qualities that allowed survival 70,000 years ago remain relevant today. Humanity faces different challenges now: climate change, resource depletion, conflicts between groups, environmental degradation. But the solutions still require cooperation, innovation, and long-term thinking. The lessons from the bottleneck period remain applicable. We can look at our ancestors' survival and draw hope. They faced odds that seemed insurmountable and prevailed. They adapted to rapidly changing conditions. They developed new technologies and strategies. They maintained their culture and identity through generations of hardship. If they could survive the bottleneck, what might we be capable of? At the same time, the bottleneck should inspire humility. Humanity came close to extinction. Perhaps closer than we'll ever know with certainty. The difference between our existence and our non-existence came down to small margins. A few thousand people in the right refuges, possessing the right knowledge, making the right decisions. We shouldn't take our continued existence for granted. The genetic legacy of the bottleneck also teaches us about human nature. We're not infinitely malleable. The genes we inherited, shaped by millions of years of evolution including the bottleneck period, influence our tendencies and capacities. But neither are we prisoners of our genes. Culture allows us to transcend genetic limitations, to create new ways of living, to adapt to circumstances our ancestors never faced. As you drift toward sleep tonight, or as you continue with your day, carry with you this awareness of deep connection to all humanity. The thread that connects you to the generation that almost went extinct is unbroken, a chain of survival stretching across 70,000 years and 3,000 generations. In your genes are written the triumphs and struggles of countless ancestors. In your capacity for language and culture are echoes of ancient innovations developed under pressure. In your very existence is proof that life persists, that challenges can be overcome, that hope is justified even in the darkest times. The story of the bottleneck is your story. The people who survived were not mythical heroes but ordinary humans facing extraordinary circumstances. They felt fear and hope, love and loss. They struggled and persevered. They were, in all important ways, like you. Their gift to you is your existence. Your opportunity is to carry their legacy forward, to add your own chapter to the ongoing human story, to ensure that the thread remains unbroken for future generations. If this journey through time resonated with you, perhaps others seeking knowledge and rest might appreciate it too. You might share it, or leave a thought about where you're listening from, what connections you've drawn, what reflections it inspired. Or you need do nothing at all except rest, knowing you're part of an ancient, resilient lineage. For now, as the stars will overhead as they've done for millions of years, as the earth turns through its cycles of day and night, warmth and cold, scarcity and abundance, the descendants of the bottleneck survivors continue their journey. We carry forward the legacy of those who refuse to go extinct. Thank you for traveling through time with me tonight. May the knowledge of your deep connection to all humanity bring you peace. May the resilience of your ancestors inspire you. And may the thread that connects past, present, and future remain unbroken. Rest well.